You're now watching the Mystical Green Beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the Mystical Green Beanie, and welcome to part 3 of my Ultimate Spider-Man Mega Review, retrospective, pseudo-analysis thing. And today, I'm going to tackle the second half of Volume 2, because this is where we basically get into all of the Death of Ultimate Spider-Man stuff. Okay, so just a quick recap, okay, it's weird. So, not much really happened in the previous 15 issues, but a lot happened as well. Peter and MJ got back together, Gwen ran away from home, Peter got his old job back at the Daily Bugle, Kitty had to go on the run, and Iceman and Human Torch still live with Peter. But yeah, aside from those status quo changes, not much really happened. I know that sounds contradictory, but if you go back and read it, you'll understand what I'm trying to say. But yeah, this is where the book reverts back to its original numbering, and it's to celebrate the 150th anniversary issue. And to kick off this whole Death of Spider-Man thing, we cut to the Ultimates basically discussing what they should do about Spider-Man, because at this moment in time in the Ultimate Universe, Carol Danvers is the director of S.H.I.E.L.D, and she has absolutely no idea what to do with Spider-Man. He's just running around New York City in a skin-tight Halloween costume, fighting genetic freaks and monsters, and he's not affiliated with anyone. He's a private party meddling in very delicate and very complex matters which he doesn't fully understand, and in her eyes, he creates a serious security risk. So Carol calls a meeting with Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America, and as far as Thor and Iron Man go, they don't really care. They've seen Spider-Man in action, and they thought that he was doing just fine. But then there's Cap. And Cap recounts his last encounter with Spider-Man, and it didn't go as smoothly as it should have, and as a result, Steve thinks that Peter either needs training or needs to hang up his costume, because he's gonna get someone killed. And what basically ends up happening is that Carol Danvers arranges a meeting with Aunt May, and they decide that it would be best if Peter underwent training with S.H.I.E.L.D. Later on, Gwen comes back home and tells Aunt May that she went to go find her mom, who I neglected to mention in my review for Volume 1, walked out on her and her father, and what we find out is that her mother had a new family, and told Gwen that she never wanted her, and that God cursed her by sticking her with Gwen and her father, and Gwen runs back home to Aunt May, who goes ham on Gwen's mom on the phone later that day, and it's absolutely fantastic. Meanwhile, Bendis also seeds Bombshell as a supporting character for the cast, but she never actually becomes a supporting cast member for Peter, because he dies, but I'll talk about that later on in the video. Anyways, Iron Man shows up at Peter's house and is all like, "I'm here for Peter's training," and Aunt May and Gwen start freaking out because this is Iron Man on the lawn of this random old lady who has already been involved in multiple crazy incidences in the neighborhood, screaming and shouting about training Spider-Man. So, after Aunt May and Gwen freak out, Tony realizes that he's just made a really bad mistake, and he tries to play it off, and then he flies away. Afterwards, Peter, Johnny, and Bobby get back home, and they see that Gwen is back, and this is where we get that glorious scene where Aunt May is just letting Gwen's mom know exactly how she feels about her, and it's perfect. And from there, Gwen and Peter agree that their relationship was never something that should have happened in the first place, so this is where they officially break it off. And after all that goes on, Tony does what he should have done in the first place, and calls Peter and lets him know that it's time for him to start his training. And I love this, because even though Spider-Man Homecoming superficially borrows from this plot thread, it's completely played opposite to how it is in the movie. Because here, even though Peter does look up to Tony Stark, he doesn't really feel like he needs to impress him at all. But not only that, unlike Spider-Man Homecoming, Tony thinks that Peter is doing just fine the way he is, and he lets him know that right off the bat. So instead of training, they just sort of hang out and talk about life and science and stuff. But then there's an explosion downtown and they need to see to it. Okay, so as I mentioned in the previous Ultimate Spider-Man video, Mysterio was setting himself up to make some major moves in New York City, but so was Black Cat. And throughout this second volume, Mysterio and Black Cat have been trying to steal this artifact from the Kingpin called the Zodiac Key. And what it does is, well, actually, we don't know what it does for sure, but it does blow up a lot. So, maybe that's what it does. But Felicia and Mysterio have had this weird team-up / double-cross thing going on, and when she tries to use the Zodiac Key against him, it ends up blowing up a huge section of the city. And then there's this big battle between Mysterio, Spider-Man, and Iron Man, and Tony figures out that Mysterio is a robot that's being controlled remotely, and we don't have to worry about that right now because that's a plot point that won't be wrapped up until about 3 years after this is established. Anyways, after Tony flies away because he's no longer relevant to the story, Peter and Felicia help some civilians, and then after that we get directly into the death of Ultimate Spider-Man. Now before I go any further, I have to admit, in retrospect, I completely understand why so many people were angry with this comic and were so hesitant to accept Miles Morales. Because this is rushed, and even though it's a well-written story, you can tell it was rushed. Because as I just mentioned, plot lines were dropped and character arcs were put on hold, all just to get rid of Peter and introduce Miles. And I see now why so many people rejected him. It does feel less character and story driven, and unfortunately, more agenda driven. But that's all I'm gonna say on that. As for the story itself, I like it a lot. In many ways, this is what the death of Superman wishes it were. So in keeping with the whole Peter needs training idea, Steve Rogers picks Peter up and tells him to put a suit on so that they can train. But then as they have a very subtle conversation about death, Norman Osborn conveniently breaks out of the Triskelion, and then he breaks out the other members of the Sinister Six as well. And again, you can tell that the story wasn't as well thought out because Norman Osborn breaks out of the Triskelion the exact same way he did the last time. S.H.I.E.L.D. underestimates his powers, then he freaks out, turns into the Green Goblin, and then rushes off to kill Peter. But whatever. Anyways, the Sinister Six tag along, and he starts calling them Men of God, because he's crazy, I guess? Anyways, while all of this is going on, the Avengers vs. Ultimate storyline is happening, and that's taking up the majority of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s attention, so they're not really focused on what the Sinister Six is doing, so they can easily roam around the city. And while they're chilling out and assembling a battle strategy to kill Spider-Man, Doc Ock tells Norman that he doesn't want to kill Spider-Man. He just wants to be a scientist. He never wanted to be a supervillain or a terrorist or a child murderer. And after taking this into consideration, Norman proceeds to knock Otto's head from his shoulders. And I mean that literally. And it's pretty gnarly. So now the remaining forces of the Sinister Six head towards Peter's house, and Peter, who was off doing whatever he was doing, gets a call from MJ, and she tells him what's been going on, and then he rushes home. But on his way, he gets caught in the battle between the Avengers and the Ultimates, and he gets shot. And then there's a whole tie-in issue that deals with all of that, but then the bridge collapses and everyone leaves, and Peter makes his way home, even though he's mortally wounded. Now, once the Sinister Six reach Peter's house, they're greeted by Human Torch and Iceman, who are quickly disposed of because this is a Spider-Man book, and they're essentially sidekicks. So Peter shows up, and he's lost his mask, and he just fights the Sinister Six in his neighborhood with all of his neighbors watching, and they witness his last stand. Aunt May shoots Electro in the chest, Mary Jane runs over the Green Goblin with a semi-truck, and Iceman and Human Torch continue to be useless. And it's the end. This is it. And when Norman Osborn is down, he starts muttering to Peter, who is slowly dying from not just the battle, but the gunshot wound that he got earlier, and he picks up the huge semi-truck that MJ just ran him over with, and he starts to beat Norman Osborn to death with it, and then it blows up, and Peter gets caught in the blast, and he dies. And it's just awesome and sad. And as much as you guys know that I love Superman, I feel like this does what the death of Superman wanted to do, but 100 times better, even though it is insanely rushed and for cynical reasons. That said, what I said about the first half of Volume 2 still applies to the second half as well. It's good, but it's nowhere near the quality of storytelling that we got from Volume 1. Also, as I mentioned previously, everything with the second half of this volume is rushed so that Bendis can get rid of Peter Parker and replace him with Miles. And as I've said a million times on the channel, I love Miles. But I can't help but feel like his introduction to the Marvel legacy was driven by a cynical editorial mandate to push diversity within their line and check off a box on their diversity list. And unfortunately, even though I prefer this story to the death of Superman, it has the same exact problem as the death of Superman in the sense that it wasn't a creative decision. It was a stunt. A stunt that halted any creative possibility with the already established characters. Now, as for the art, the first half of the story was done by Dave LaFuente, who, as I stated in my last Ultimate Spider-Man review, was the primary artist for Volume 2 of Ultimate Spider-Man. But once we get into the actual Death of Spider-Man arc, Mark Bagley comes back, and his art feels like he never left. It feels natural and homely, and I'm not entirely sure that's a word, but you get the point. And as much as I loved all of the talent that did the art on Ultimate Spider-Man after he left, seeing his art in the pages of Ultimate Spider-Man once again just felt right. But yeah, guys, that's it. That's all for Volume 2 of Ultimate Spider-Man. But what about you? What did you think of the death of Ultimate Spider-Man? And really, just what did you think of Volume 2 as a whole? Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.